Now, at least 800 Palestinian civilians and 21 Jewish civilians were injured in continued violence in occupied East Jerusalem. Africa for Palestine has condemned the violence and marched against it in Cape Town. Muhammed Desai from the group joins me live now. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. This issue is often framed as a religious war or clash. Is that your understanding of what's taking place?
Hi, Nzinga. Thanks for covering this issue. It's unfortunate that people conflate the biblical land of Israel with the modern state of Israel created in 1948. It was really the creation of the modern state of Israel that set in action and set in motion the current situation that we see today, when the indigenous population were removed in order for a foreign population to create a new country. The most recent violence that we are seeing being unleashed in the Gaza Strip as we speak is really as a result of Israel's policies of discrimination and occupation and violations of international law that it is committing against the Palestinian people.
What are the economic implications for Israel and Palestine as this violence continues?
The last time that the Israeli regime had bombed the Gaza Strip to such a degree was in 2014. In 2014, Israel killed over 2,500 Palestinians, including more than 551 of them children under the age of 16. And as a result of global outrage, as well as campaigning and activism by various non-governmental organizations and social movements across the world, Israel's foreign direct investment dropped by almost 50%, it dropped by 46%, and this was according to a UN report released in 2015. So Israel does suffer economic consequences from its actions, which are increasingly being considered as violations of international law. In addition, the most recent move by the International Criminal Court to open an investigation into prosecuting Israel for possible war crimes and crimes against humanity is going to have a chilling effect on investors wanting to be in such a country, in such a volatile regime.
US President Joe Biden said to reporters that Israel has a right to protect itself from the barrage of rockets, possibly putting the world's most powerful nation on the side of Israel.
It's unfortunate that even during the struggle against apartheid, when the majority of states and countries across the African continent, Europe, Latin America, and elsewhere had taken a very firm position against support, trade, and having financial relations with apartheid South Africa, that the United States was still one of the few backers, together with Israel, mind you, of apartheid South Africa. Likewise, today, the United States is remaining this backer of the Israeli regime, but there are massive changes which are taking place in the US. For example, you have the recent election of progressive Congress people that in April this year have asked that the $3.8 billion that gets given annually, $3.8 billion US dollars that gets given annually to Israel be conditioned that it does not get used in human rights abuses against Palestinian children and against Palestinians living in the occupied Palestinian territories. In addition, you have a growing number of young Jewish students on US campuses that are probably at the forefront of the Palestinian solidarity movement and the economic sanctions campaigns that are currently underway with regard to the Israeli regime. And so whilst the US establishment seems to be hanging on to its support of the Israeli regime, we do think that the US is going to become isolated in the global arena and will be forced to also take progressive policies in terms of isolating the Israeli regime because of its violations of international law. But in addition to that global isolation, it would seem as if there are positive moves on the ground in the United States, which is a cause for a celebration.
All right. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said last year that this issue can be resolved by dialogue, reconciliation and reason. Do you think that's possible? And also, I just want to go back to the beginning when we were talking about the economic benefits. What would the economic benefits be from peace or resolution to this violence that we're seeing?
Well, we know from the South African experience that once the apartheid regime had committed itself to at least respect certain basic demands of the African National Congress, the Pan-African Congress, and the various other liberation movements, and these demands including, for example, the release of political prisoners, the unbanning of political organizations, that this then allowed fair, just, and more equal negotiations to take place and dialogue to happen. Whilst this process of negotiation was taking place in our country, it did also offer a greater opportunity for South Africa to be exposed to international markets. So likewise with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, we do feel that if the Israeli regime is really interested in dialogue, that it too will consider the very basic demands that are being outlined by the Palestinian liberation organizations, including, for example, the release of the more than 5,000 Palestinian political prisoners. These basic demands being met by the Israeli state will create the conditions for a just peace to be negotiated, which will ultimately benefit not only in terms of political liberation, but also in terms of economic liberation, because the Israeli regime today, as we speak, has been boycotted by major corporations, the Dutch pension fund, the Swedish pension fund, the Norwegian pension fund, which is the second largest such pension fund in the world, have all withdrawn their investments from Israel because of its violations of international law. The world's richest person, Bill Gates, withdrew almost $2 million worth of investments from a security company because of that company's involvement with the Israeli prison system. So Israel is paying and is facing economic hardship because of its violations of international law.
Muhammed Desai from Africa for Palestine, thanks for your time on SABC News this afternoon.